Hello, I am Tammy Marshall. Thank you for visiting my channel. Today I'm going to read to you the fourth chapter of my novel called Ticker Tape. This is about my Vietnam veteran, Marvin, and how he ends up going back to Vietnam later, and it kind of changes his life. But the chapter I'm going to read is quite fitting for the holiday that's coming up next week. So here's the fourth chapter. If you haven't heard the first three, you can go back the playlist. The playlists have all of my novels. All of my novels has portions of the beginnings of each one. You can certainly listen to the first three chapters of this book and get caught up if you'd like, or just enjoy this chapter and see if you want to listen to the others. This one is about his ex-wife from her perspective, Bess. So Bess, Boise, Idaho, November 23rd, 1972. Bessie, come help me set the table. The guests will be coming any minute now. Betsy Reynolds called to her daughter. Bess reluctantly pulled herself away from the television set where she'd been spending most of her free time these past few months watching the latest news about the war. She was hoping to hear about Marvin's squadron of bombers because they'd made the news a few times. But that had been weeks ago. From what she understood about events over there, his special missions as a flight navigator were over, but she hadn't heard from him in almost 2 months now, and she was worried. As soon as she walked away from the TV, her father, John, rose from where he'd been pretending to snooze on the couch, and he crouched down in front of the set to flip the channel to NBC for any preliminary coverage of the Thanksgiving football showdown between his beloved San Francisco 49ers and the seemingly unbeatable Dallas Cowboys. Bess shook her head in mock disgust. She had suspected he was feigning sleep to give her some privacy from her concerns over Marvin's well being, but she wished he'd at least wait until she was out of the room before bolting for the TV to watch some silly football game. She called back to him. You know, you can't watch that darn old game while we eat anyway, Dad. She heard him grunt a reply as she stepped into the humid kitchen. Crack a window in here, Mom. She fanned herself with the closest tea towel. It's like a sauna. She started to open the window over the sink, but her mother chided her. It's freezing out there. Leave it be. Just take these plates into the dining room and get the good silverware from the buffet in there. She heaved 8 thick plates into Bess's arm and waved her away. As she passed through the kitchen, Bess gaped at the feast her mother had managed to prepare that morning with no help from anyone in the household. Are we feeding an army? She asked before stepping into the sunny dining room. Her mother sang out, It's best to be overprepared than underdone. Bess rolled her eyes at her mother's standard inane use of precepts that always seemed to fall just short of their intended meaning. She placed the heavy ceramic plates firmly in the middle of each of the special autumn themed placemats her mother dug out every year for Thanksgiving dinner. After today, the placemats would be rolled up and stored until the next Thanksgiving, but the plates would see more action at Christmas and again at Easter. Stepping back to make sure each plate was positioned evenly enough to please her picky mother, she noticed a small chip in the edge of one of them. Not wanting to take the blame for marring her mother's prized plates, which had been purchased on a whim years ago from a boutique that specialized in selling handmade products from Mexico, she moved the chipped plate to her brother's spot. Then she opened the door of the buffet and pulled out the special wooden silverware box. She lifted the lid and began to count out 8 knives, spoons, and forks. Just then, her younger brother Chet came into the room carrying a vase filled with mums that mirrored the pattern of reds, yellows, and oranges on the placemats. He held the vase out in front of him as if it were odoriferous and putrefying. Where do you want this? He growled. She motioned with her chin. Just set it in the middle of the table. Chet veritably slammed the vase down in an area of the table that could only vaguely be considered the middle. Then he scowled at his sister. Mom says for you to stop dawdling and come help her carry the food out here. She scowled back at him. Go help her yourself. I'm busy. He turned and left in a huff. I hate this stupid holiday. Why can't we eat on TV trays in front of the television like normal people? Bess heard her mother lecturing her brother and asking her father to come help too, so things could be ready before company arrived. She started to place the silverware onto each of the neatly folded green linen Thanksgiving napkins beside each plate when the doorbell rang. I'll get it, called her father and her brother simultaneously and Bess stifled a laugh as her mother appeared carrying a steaming bowl of mashed potatoes. She set it neatly down on the table, moved the vase of flowers into the exact center of the table, and hurried out, wiping her hands on her apron while removing it at the same time. Bess followed her into the hallway where her great Aunt Ethel was shaking snow off her scarf and handing it to her father. Ethel's husband, Frank, was slipping out of his shoes and following her father into the living room to catch a little of the football game before they were sentenced to family time in the dining room. She hugged both of her elderly relatives, knowing that they were the stand ins for grandparents who couldn't be there due to the distance, their poor health, and the weather. Ethel and Frank lived 5 blocks away, and they were childless, so they attended every holiday celebration at Bess's parents' house. They'd soon be followed by Louise, her father's widowed sister, and Louise's daughter, Mary. While Bess loved her Aunt Louise, she detested her cousin Mary. She always had. Mary was a year older than she was, and they'd attended the same schools their whole lives. Mary was one of those girls that everyone despised, while at the same time seeming to adore her because of her beauty and fake charm. Bess had seen through her cousin's facade from an early age and refused to play with her at family functions. So Mary had made it her mission to spread vicious rumors about Bess at school, to trip her in the halls when no one was looking, and to exclude her from any school activity in which Mary was firmly entrenched, which was most of them. Mary's husband was overseas too, but he was working a desk job, while Marvin was risking his life every day flying over enemy territory. Mary made no bones about asking about Marvin and expressing concern for his safety at every opportunity, while doing it in such a way as to bring attention to the mortal peril he was in each day. While Bess loved the Thanksgiving holiday, she agreed with her brother's general sentiment about it today. She hated this particular Thanksgiving because she would be spending it with Mary. The doorbell rang again, and in stepped Louise, followed by Mary. Bess hugged her aunt and nonchalantly waved a greeting at her cousin before relieving her of the 2 pumpkin pies she was carrying. The only good thing about having Mary over for Thanksgiving was that she made excellent pumpkin pie. They were spared having to speak to each other by an energetic cheer that arose from the 3 males standing in front of the TV. Bess carried the pies to the dining room and set them on the buffet. After much scolding from her mother, the men finally pulled themselves away from the TV and joined the ladies at the dining table. As Frank lowered himself into a chair next to his wife, he smacked his lips in delight. "I see you've outdone yourself as usual, Betsy." Bess watched her mother smile with genuine pleasure. Frank had always been her mother's favorite relative, sometimes surpassing even her own children, Bess suspected. "Thank you, Uncle Frank. Would you care to lead us in prayer?" Hearing Chet's groan of protest, Bess tried to shush him before he expressed himself for all to hear, but she failed to reach his shin with a kick in time. "Why do we have to pray now? We never pray before any other meal. Seems pretty hypocritical." John glared at his son, a boy who he often openly referred to as "that damn hippie son of mine," and replied in as level of a tone as he could muster in front of their company, "Because it's a special day and we should be grateful, very, very grateful for what we have in a world full of people who are starving and fighting and dying overseas." Chet rolled his eyes. "And you think our little prayer is going to make one bit of difference to some so called benevolent being who allows stupid wars to go on forever?" John's teeth were now gritted, and Bess stared across at her brother, silently pleading with her eyes for him to shut up. But he wasn't looking at her. She managed to reach his shin and gave it a strong nudge. He barely registered it with a swift glance her way, and then he moved his legs out of her reach. "This isn't the time for an argument about the war," the father was saying. "If you don't want to pray, then just sit there silently while the rest of us do." He then nodded at Frank to go ahead. Bess watched Chet across his arms and leaned back with a supercilious look upon his face. Then she bowed her head over her folded hands. She didn't really pay attention to Frank's prayer of thanksgiving. Instead, she offered up her own prayer, her standard prayer lately, a request that her husband be returned to her safely and that the war in Vietnam come to an end. She agreed with Chet on one level. Why should God, in whatever form he took, care one iota about her prayers when he clearly had much more important things to worry about? Some nights she would go to bed so angry at the world for the horrors she saw on TV or read in the papers that she'd vow not to talk to God anymore. But those were the nights she'd lie awake, tossing and turning for hours until she'd finally relent and offer up a prayer for the safety of the man she loved and all the others fighting for a cause that many of them, including Marvin, didn't really believe in. Caught up in her own thoughts of Marvin, it took her a moment to realize that the others were no longer praying. She unfolded her hands and reached out to pick up the bowl of green beans that was sitting in front of her plate. As she did so, her eyes caught those of her cousin, whose eyebrows were raised slightly as she looked at Bess. Seeing that Mary was about to ask her something, Bess directed a comment at her great Aunt Ethel, who was seated next to Mary. I love that blouse. Is it new? Ethel glanced down at her shirt and laughed. This old thing, it's probably about 30 years old. Bess blushed a little. Well, it's a lovely blouse, and it really looks good on you. Ethel beamed. Thank you. She turned a look of disapproval upon her husband. Some people say I don't look good in orange. Well, you don't, Frank said matter of factly while taking a bite of potatoes. To everyone's merriment, half the potatoes fell off his fork and landed on his lap. Well, shit, he said. Betsy handed her uncle a napkin and rose, saying, Let me go grab you a towel. Better make it a bib, Ethel called after her. Bess laughed and looked at her brother, who was also grinning despite himself. Suddenly, her cheerfulness was cut short by Mary's voice. So, Bessie, have you heard from Marvin? Bess clenched her jaw as soon as her cousin called her Bessie, a term reserved only for those closest to Bess, and she certainly didn't consider her spoiled, self serving cousin to be among those even remotely close to her. Not in a while, she replied, trying to remove the acid from her tone. Have you heard from Bob? Mary bestowed her dazzling smile upon her cousin and then upon those around the table. Yes, I have. Just 2 days ago, I got his most recent letter. Then she looked back at Bess. I certainly hope nothing has happened to Marvin. Bess wanted to reach over and slap that smug look off her cousin's face. Instead, she half heartedly said, I'm sure he's fine. Thankfully, her father came to her rescue. Yes, let's stay positive. This is a day to be thankful for what we have, not for what we're missing. Just then, a muffled roar came from the living room where her father had left the TV set on, despite his wife's admonishments to the contrary. Speaking of positives, I'll be right back. He stood and rushed from the room before his wife could stop him. Those remaining at the table avoided her gaze and remained mute until they heard John exclaiming his approval from the next room. He returned, saying, The 49ers just scored again. Frank and he jumped into a discussion of the teams playing in the game with a few comments thrown in by Chet. The ladies, barring Bess, expressed their usual disgust at the men of the family and then turned their conversation to the meal and their shopping plans for the following day. Bess focused on eating and thinking about Marvin. She'd give anything to have him here and would gladly let him watch football games all day if he were. And she had no intention of joining her mother and her aunt for early Christmas shopping tomorrow. She planned to write Marvin another long letter and hope it somehow made it to him before Christmas. Bess reached for the pickles, and as she did so, she noticed her father's posture change. He was suddenly sitting more erect, his attention focused on something outside the front windows. She turned her head and saw the side of a dark sedan with part of an official emblem visible on the passenger door. Before the meaning of the car's presence in front of her parents' house fully registered in her consciousness, she felt the room go quiet around her. She rose, as if in a trance, and was surprised to find her father and a great uncle on either side of her. The front doorbell rang, its notes echoing through the now silent house. Even a lull in the football game had caused the television to hush its raucous tone in reverence for what was about to happen. Betsy, go answer the door, her father growled in a low whisper at her mother. No, Bess said, and was shocked to hear herself sounding so calm. She shook off the well meaning hands of the two men and walked to the front door. She felt her father's presence just behind her, though, and was comforted by it. She watched her hand grab the doorknob and turn it. She felt herself tug the door a little harder than usual, and she counted an eternity of seconds as the door swung inward. The young man waiting on the front steps was dressed in full Air Force regalia, and he held a telegram between his gloved fingers. As she pushed open the outer screen door, he removed his hat and placed it under his arm. Mrs. Wineski? He asked politely. She nodded almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Marvin Wineski? He asked, as if in clarification. Yes, she managed to say. She could hear her Aunt Louise exclaiming, "Oh, my dear Lord!" over and over from the dining room, followed by Mary's unmistakable shrill voice saying, "For the love of God, Mother, shut up!" The young man gazed with genuine compassion into her eyes as he passed her the telegram. "I'm deeply sorry, ma'am. If the United States Air Force can be of service to you in any way, don't hesitate to call." Then he nodded at her and her father, as well as at the others standing in the shadows behind her, replaced his cap, returned, and went back to his waiting car. After taking the paper from his outstretched hand, she stood looking down at it in puzzlement. Suddenly, she found herself unable to understand printed English. "Daddy?" she managed to croak out as she turned to him with tears flowing. He removed the telegram from her shaking hand. "I've got it, sweetheart. Let's go into the other room." "No," she whispered. "Just tell me what it says." She watched her father read the paper, and his expression changed from a deeply furrowed look of dread to a lesser furrowed look of surprise. "He's MIA." "What?" She felt herself sway a bit. Her father looked up at her with tears in his eyes. "He's missing, honey." "Not dead?" she asked incredulously. Her father gave her a shaky smile. "Not according to this." She swayed more and almost blacked out. "Come on," her father insisted as he firmly grabbed her arm. "Let's sit down and you can read it for yourself." Bess acquiesced. They all hurried into the living room. "Chet, shut that damn TV off," her father ordered, and for once in his life, Chet obeyed without a snide remark or a scowl. Her father helped her sit in the nearest chair, then he handed her the telegram. She wiped her eyes and studied the small piece of paper that had shattered her family's Thanksgiving happiness, but that had managed to avoid permanently shattering her own happiness. According to the telegram, Marvin's plane was shot down over enemy territory on October 19th. Wreckage of the plane was recovered a few hundred yards off the coast, but there had been no sign of either Marvin or his pilot since then, despite intensive searches for them. Officially, the two men were considered missing in action until such a time that their remains or their whereabouts were discovered. Bess started to cry. Her initial relief at hearing the MIA letters changed to certain dread at the knowledge that Marvin's plane ended up in the ocean. She was certain that he and his pilot Mac, a man she'd become fond of through Marvin's letters, were at the bottom of the sea. She relayed those fears to her father. He acknowledged that there was some merit to them, but he was quick to remind her that if the Air Force had found the plane, they'd certainly have some way of knowing if the men went down with it or not. "I bet they ejected, and the Air Force knows that. I bet the Air Force found their plane and the seats were missing because they made it out before the plane went down." The others joined in, agreeing with her father's assessment of the situation. For a moment, she felt a surge of relief wash over her, but then the full weight of Marvin's situation descended upon her. October 19th was weeks ago. If he'd been injured and not found, then by now he'd surely succumbed and was probably rotting in some horrible jungle. She'd heard awful stories of what the heat and humidity of the jungles in Vietnam did to a living man. She didn't want to imagine what they'd do to a dead one. If he'd been found by the enemy, he was a prisoner, and they'd all heard even worse horror stories of the conditions in which the war prisoners were kept and the punishment inflicted upon them. Either way, her Marvin may never come home to her. Bess began to sob. Her family crowded around her, attempting to comfort her. Suddenly, Mary's voice cut through all the others. "I'm so thankful that Bob is safely ensconced in Thailand." Bess heard Louise trying to shush her daughter, but it only caused Mary to add, "Well, I am. I couldn't imagine getting a telegram." The rest of Mary's comment went unsaid as Louise slapped her. Bess looked up and saw her aunt pointing her finger at her daughter's face. Bess had never seen her aunt so livid or her cousin so contrite. "John," she called to her brother, "get our coats. Mary and I are leaving." John rose from Bess's side and strode to the front closet. He yanked open the double doors and reached in, tugging their parkas off the hangers in one motion. He politely handed one to his sister and rudely tossed the other to his niece, who just managed to catch it one-handed, her other hand still rubbing the cheek her mother had struck. Then Mary turned and looked at Bess. Her cousin opened her mouth as though she wanted to say something, but Bess narrowed her eyes and scowled darkly at her. Mary flushed and looked away as she wrapped her coat around her shoulders. "Thank you for the excellent meal, Betsy." Louise called to Bess's mother, who appeared in the hallway sporting a pie. She tried to pass it on to her sister in law, but Louise refused to take it. I'll call you later, she said to Betsy and to John. Then she tugged the door open and motioned angrily for her daughter to precede her. As Betsy shut the door behind them, a silence descended upon the room, and the long, swear word laden tirade directed toward Mary by Louise could be heard all the way down the front walkway to Louise's car parked at the end of their lane. Bess allowed herself the briefest of smiles as her eyes swept across the worried faces of her parents, her brother, and her great aunt and uncle. Just above Frank's shoulder, Marvin smiled down upon her from the large portrait taken of him and her on their wedding day 3 years ago. Her face crumpled, along with the telegram she held in her clenched fist. So, that again was during the Vietnam portion of this. This takes place over many, many years. Gets into the 1980s, and that's time frame in which he ends up going back to Vietnam. So there's a lot of stuff that happens in here. This book is special to me. My dad was a Vietnam veteran. I'm an American Legion writer. I spend a lot of time with Vietnam vets, so they deserve, they deserve our respect. So if you'd ever like to read more of Ticker Tape, it's available as an ebook or paperback on Amazon, as are my other books. Until next time, thanks.